At first glance, Chile's geography looks like a disadvantage. 4,300 kilometers of territory where deserts, volcanoes, glaciers, and earthquakes stretch a country to its limits. That north-south span makes it the skinniest nation on Earth, a strip of land that seems fragile on the map. But in 2025, those same limits are being reinterpreted. The Atacama supports the world's clean energy ambitions, the Andes fuel hydro and wind corridors, and the southern ports connect directly to Antarctic science and logistics. Instead of only survival, Chile's shape now frames how policy choices on renewables, lithium, and trade are turning geography into leverage. A country stretched to the extreme. Chile occupies one of the most unusual shapes of any nation on Earth, a strip stretched 4,300 kilometers from north to south, yet never more than a couple hundred kilometers wide. In some places, the land narrows to under 100 kilometers, barely the distance between the Andes on one side and the Pacific on the other. Trying to fit a population, an economy, and a political system into this elongated frame is not straightforward. The geography creates structural pressures that still shape life in 2025, not only to Chile's disadvantage, but also in ways that force creative adaptation. Measured north to south, the country feels endless. You could drive for days from the Atacama Desert near Peru, through fertile valleys and bustling cities, and still be only partway toward the windswept edges of Patagonia. Yet east to west, the country can vanish in an instant, compressed between mountains and ocean. This central paradox, extreme length combined with extreme thinness, dictates how Chile holds together. Roads, rail, energy lines, and digital cables all tend to flow in a linear corridor, running parallel to the Andes and the coast, because there simply isn't space for east-west dispersal. That design funnels all movement and logistics into a narrow strip, magnifying distance even more. Externally, this layout links Chile firmly to the Pacific world. Merchant ships cross from Asia and dock along its shorelines, where billions of dollars in copper, fresh produce, and increasingly lithium are loaded back into global supply chains. In this sense, Chile is squarely positioned on one of the busiest maritime trade highways of the 21st century. Internally, however, geography fractures the country into zones that often feel semi-detached. A person living in Punta Arenas at the southern tip may feel closer to Argentine towns across the border than to Santiago. By the same logic, a miner working in the high desert near Bolivia can experience the capital as a distant center of decisions rather than an immediate hub. National unity cannot rely on the map alone. It has to be reinforced by infrastructure, governance, and culture. The Andes play a decisive role in this. Rising above 6,000 meters at several peaks, they are both natural fortress and logistical barrier. They shield Chile from major continental rivals, but also make internal connections difficult. Building highways or pipelines over such mountains requires enormous investment, limiting most flows of people and goods to that single north-south axis. Directionality becomes inescapable. The country functions like a corridor, efficient for linking regions in sequence, but slow to bridge them to neighbors across the range. This elongation exaggerates distance, so that even cities within the same nation sometimes feel like they inhabit parallel worlds. Yet because all of Chile's territory faces west, the country's orientation is tightly aligned to the Pacific, unlike landlocked or continent-facing states. That outlook is a consistent advantage. What once was labeled weakness, distance without width, has instead cultivated adaptive strength. Chile cannot expand over vast plains as Argentina does, so it has developed vertically, stacking vineyards onto terraces cut into cliffs, stringing settlements along coastal edges, and anchoring highways against mountain walls. Every major town slots into narrow gaps between peaks and sea, and with no space to waste, efficiency becomes a habit. That pattern extends to ports as well. Instead of scattering in multiple directions, they line up on the same ocean-facing side, simplifying coordination and concentrating export power in a way few competitors can match. These same contrasts show up in issues of connectivity. To the outside world, Chile is hyperconnected. Cargo routes, undersea cables, and shipping exchanges tie it directly to Asia, North America, and Europe. Within its own borders, though, communities can still feel disconnected, sometimes reachable only by boat or circuitous flights. Storms in the south or rockfalls in the north can isolate villages for days. For residents of remote fjords, disconnection is a lived reality. The contradiction is stark. Chile can send lithium to Shanghai in less time than it takes to repair a broken road linking two of its own towns. Thinness multiplies these contrasts, producing a place at once global in reach and locally fragmented. Economic patterns mirror these tensions. Copper and lithium extraction in the northern deserts generates immense export wealth. Yet moving that output down the narrow corridor toward central hubs can be slow and expensive. Meanwhile, fruit producers in the central valleys enjoy a near-perfect arrangement. Fertile land within hours of major ports, where crops head straight to international markets. Geography accelerates some sectors while throttling others. Unlike larger neighbors, Chile cannot spread growth evenly across wide landscapes. Its long outline tends to draw resources and influence into the central belt around Santiago, leaving frontier zones less developed. The imbalance is not just historical inertia. It is shaped by the distribution of land itself. In earlier eras, such fragility made Chile especially vulnerable. Earthquakes could twist the long ribbon and fracture connections with little redundancy to fall back on. A collapsed bridge or damaged port could strand an entire region. Over time, however, Chile has transformed these vulnerabilities into prompts for resilience. Buildings have become some of the most earthquake-resistant in the world. Digital networks extend through fiber strands running thousands of kilometers, and transmission lines knit together energy corridors across deserts and fjords. What geography withholds in redundancy, Chile compensates for in design. Constraint becomes a spur to innovation. On the geopolitical map, this elongated shape turns into a frontier. In the far north, borders with Peru and Bolivia remain symbolic and strategic, shaped by historical conflicts and current resource wealth. To the east, relations with Argentina alternately resemble partnership and rivalry, hinging on development projects in Patagonia and cross-Andes connections. To the south, Antarctica looms large, with Chile serving as a springboard for logistics and scientific research. Foreign powers read geography as opportunity. Anchoring operations in Chile provides unmatched access between southern Atlantic routes and Pacific basins. Its land may be thin, but its strategic reach is extending. Even social life reflects these dual pressures. Communities cling to the thin edge between mountains and ocean, fostering a linear sense of belonging. Migrants moving up and down the country rarely break from that corridor. Deserts, central plains, and channels line up along the same trajectory, reinforcing continuity more than dispersal. This produces a culture shaped less by regional divergence and more by a shared strip of lived experience. Chileans remain outward-looking, scanning the Pacific because expansion inward is so limited. That habit has fused with trade ambitions, making seaborne commerce almost second nature. By 2025, leaders even highlight this thinness as an asset. The argument is straightforward. Where else can a country align three unique resource zones: desert sunlight for solar power, southern winds for turbines, and Andean rivers for hydro, along one continuous corridor? Energy companies market the idea that Chile is compact by necessity and efficient by design. Ports present themselves as predictable nodes along a single spine, rather than scattered choke points. Investment boards promote the narrative that Chile possesses focus, rather than fragmentation. Thinness, once explained as vulnerability on schoolroom maps, begins to resemble discipline in economic planning. The outline still looks awkward on a map, a ribbon trailing down the side of South America. But with each year, that ribbon reveals more of its leverage. Trade routes, energy flows, and research expeditions now depend on its strip of terrain. Global integration often outweighs internal distances. And yet, within those tight dimensions, pressures mount. Along the 4,300 kilometers of territory, some places prosper while others feel left at the margins. The strain of balancing such uneven growth is a challenge every corridor nation must face. But in Chile, the imbalance has become unusually sharp. That imbalance raises a new question. Why, out of more than 20 million citizens, are so many concentrated in the same narrow valley, while vast northern and southern regions remain underpopulated? The map alone doesn't answer that puzzle. It points instead to the deeper dynamics of Chile's heartbeat, the uneven rhythm that defines where its people live and how its future will unfold. The uneven heartbeat of Chile. Why does a country with more than 20 million people concentrate so many of them in one metropolitan basin? Chile spans deserts, fertile valleys, forests, and islands, offering plenty of space for settlement. Yet in 2025, around 40% of its population lives in and around Greater Santiago. This valley, wedged between the Andes to the east and coastal ranges to the west, has become more than a capital. It is the focal point of national life, while vast northern and southern regions remain far less populated. Santiago's dominance has deep roots. After independence, the city consolidated institutional power almost by default. Railways, early trade routes, courts, ministries, and universities all concentrated in the Central Valley. Industry followed, and once momentum built, it reinforced itself over generations. New migrants sought opportunity there, reinforcing consumer markets that drew further business and government focus. By today, the pattern has turned Santiago into a gravitational center that pulls much of Chile inward, eclipsing other regions despite their natural wealth and potential. This concentration creates visible consequences. Housing demand keeps soaring inside the capital, while rising costs push families far into suburbs and satellite towns. Metro projects and ring road expansions continually struggle to keep pace, leaving many workers with commutes stretching long into the periphery. But as cities around Santiago strain to absorb growth, smaller towns elsewhere in the country lose residents, weakening the institutions they depend on. Schools shrink, local clinics replace hospitals, and outside investment often arrives only to serve extractive projects rather than to sustain communities. The drain of young people to the capital deepens the challenge. Desert towns in the north or coastal villages in Patagonia often watch younger generations depart permanently, creating a cycle of decline. Opportunity flows away to Santiago, and its absence at home ensures further departures. This migration isn't just demographic. It shifts cultural identity, as life in the capital and neighboring valleys begins to define what most Chileans see as the country's mainstream. Other places struggle for visibility inside their own nation. The imbalance amplifies inequality. Chile's central zone enjoys faster infrastructure upgrades, more reliable internet connections, broader access to universities, and larger shares of health investment. The farther a community is from Santiago, the harder it is to secure timely support. In the far south, families sometimes turn to Argentine towns for easier access to medical treatment or supplies. In the Atacama, local residents face long waits before state projects materialize. Communities learn that living outside of central Chile often means living with slower delivery of national promises. By 2025, officials increasingly regard this centralization as a vulnerability. Concentrating government offices, transport systems, and economic hubs in one valley exposes the country to risk. Earthquakes around the metropolitan zone have previously closed Santiago's airport and disrupted nationwide logistics. Wildfires on the city's margins have threatened nearby suburbs and power supply corridors. Yet growth continues to concentrate around the region, despite repeated warnings from disaster history that tying so much capacity to one location magnifies exposure. Government strategies reflect the recognition of the problem. Through agencies such as the Ministry of Public Works and Invest Chile, active measures are funding infrastructure beyond the capital. Major projects now include the Valparaiso-Santiago Railway Concession and the orbital Norponiente Highway. Together with port tenders and renewable corridors, these initiatives aim to draw business and trade flows into regional centers, competing with Santiago's gravitational pull. While these steps represent serious investment, their ability to reverse the imbalance remains uncertain. On the cultural level, Santiago's weight dominates the national narrative. Television, film, and major publications are produced in the capital and broadcast outward, shaping debates across Chile. Regions more than 1,000 kilometers away see their concerns filtered through metropolitan priorities. Citizens note that national politics often sound like disputes among Santiago neighborhoods rather than reflections of a diverse country. This perception adds to feelings of distance and fuels frustration among populations outside the Central Valley. Migration patterns put the dynamic in sharp relief. Tens of thousands each year move into the dense central corridor stretching from Valparaiso through Santiago to Rancagua, reinforcing a tightly connected belt of population and influence. Meanwhile, provinces in the north continue losing residents despite hosting globally vital industries such as copper and lithium. Mining jobs may bring short-term income, but without long-term community investment, they do little to retain local families. In the south, depopulating schools mirror the same challenge, as younger households relocate toward urban employment opportunities further north. Policymakers are beginning to counter these trends by linking development funds to resource royalties. In the lithium triangle of the Atacama, royalties are now directed toward surrounding cities, with the goal of persuading technicians and researchers to build careers without resettling in Santiago. In Patagonia, incentives target aquaculture and renewable energy projects that depend on local ecosystems and therefore cannot simply migrate to the capital. Infrastructure investments, from new airports to upgraded regional highways, are being promoted not as feeders into Santiago, but as channels for sustaining growth locally. Housing subsidies are part of the design too. Rising real estate prices in Santiago have encouraged the government to support home ownership in smaller urban areas. Officials present this as a way to slow the exodus into the capital while developing regional markets. Yet challenges remain. Prestige job offers often remain concentrated in the metropolitan region, and international corporations prefer proximity to national ministries. For many professionals, ambition still points to Santiago first, regardless of incentives elsewhere. The uneven heartbeat of the country shapes daily life in subtle ways. In the Central Basin, people confront traffic congestion, constant construction, and political demonstrations. Beyond it, villages face shrinking services and unreliable connections to national systems, sometimes depending as much on neighboring countries as on Santiago itself. The contrast is stark, and while decentralization projects signal change, they are uphill attempts to rebalance more than a century of centralization. What distinguishes this moment is recognition at the highest levels. Overconcentration is now discussed in terms of national resilience and security, not just regional fairness. Ensuring that the entire country remains viable requires distributing people, infrastructure, and investment more equitably across its length. That ambition has not yet overcome the powerful gravity of Santiago, but the logic behind it is stronger than ever. Chile is experimenting with tools to prevent one city from overshadowing a nation thousands of kilometers long. And that brings the problem into sharper focus. Even if resources and incentives succeed, how can a country stretched over 4,000 kilometers stay connected when so much of its population and its growth clusters in one valley? This question sets the stage for Chile's next challenge, where the issue is not just where people settle, but how those settlements remain linked across an extraordinary span of land. Connectivity across an impossible distance. Keeping the thread of a nation intact across more than 4,000 kilometers is not simply a matter of territory. It is a constant test of infrastructure and planning. For Chile, this challenge defines what connectivity across an impossible distance really means. From the Atacama to Patagonia, roads, cables, airports, and now digital networks all strain against terrain that seems designed to resist them. By 2025, Chile has achieved impressive progress in making its people feel linked, but the same geography that holds it together also keeps pulling it apart. Digital access has been the most visible breakthrough of recent years. Rather than relying only on physical wires or costly land-based expansion, Chile now knits its remote zones into the national network through a combination of satellites, mobile networks, and fiber optic projects. Many previously isolated towns use satellite dishes for everything from video calls to online classrooms, allowing students in desert villages or island schools to connect with teachers based in Santiago. This matters in places where recruiting specialized staff had long been impossible. In Chile, fishing families treat fast internet as a necessity alongside electricity and water, because it anchors them to the mainland economy. With internet penetration reaching very high levels nationally, unevenness remains, but the gap between central cities and far-off communities is narrower than ever. On top of this, mobile expansion has brought reliable coverage into much of the country's linear backbone. While the exact pace of national 5G rollouts is uneven, mobile capacity has improved enough that farmers in the central valleys now monitor soil moisture with sensors linked to networks, and engineers in the north oversee remote equipment miles away from mining zones. These are not luxuries. They are the tools that make industries work efficiently across inhospitable spaces. Every antenna added along the corridor shrinks the psychological distance between settlements. Still, deserts absorb signals, peaks block transmissions, and in the fjords storms can wipe out contact, proving that failure never disappears entirely. Progress here means more people connected more often, not perfect consistency. Southern Chile illustrates this tension in its starkest form. In the Magallanes region, official maps depict Chilean continuity, but in practice roads and sea routes rarely run smoothly within national borders. In parts of this territory, traveling between two Chilean points is often faster through Argentina. A school group in Punta Arenas heading to Tierra del Fuego may drive across the Argentine side simply because the route is shorter and easier. Ambulances, freight trucks, and ordinary families do the same. Chileans describe themselves as tied to their nation by loyalty, but bound to Argentina by necessity when it comes to mobility. Aircraft sometimes take off from Argentine strips to serve Chilean emergencies, highlighting the ongoing reliance on neighbors just to keep distant communities supplied. This dependence has not gone unnoticed. For years, government agencies have worked to reinforce Chile's interior with projects that smoothen both digital and physical connections. The Digital Backbone Program, an immense fiber optic network running almost the length of the country, remains the flagship effort. Segments already connect major hubs, with extensions branching towards smaller cities. The payoff is immediate. Schools can now stream national curricula, provincial hospitals link specialists to remote patients via telemedicine, and entrepreneurs set up digital businesses from provinces that once felt permanently disconnected. These cables are not yet continuous, but with each completed section the experience of isolation lessens. Fiber lines support much more than households. Research institutions in regions far from Santiago now conduct joint projects by plugging directly into global databases. Municipalities begin to move local services online, allowing residents to pay taxes, renew licenses, or request records without traveling days to the capital. For a nation stretched thin, every successful online transaction replaces a costly physical journey. Geography cannot be erased, but its friction is reduced step by step. Air infrastructure plays an equally critical role. Expanded airports now serve regions where for most of the 20th century access demanded either punishing overland routes or unreliable ferries. In the north, flights link Antofagasta to Santiago in under 2 hours, a transformation from the all-day drive of past decades. In Patagonia, connecting flights between Punta Arenas, Puerto Montt, and Santiago anchor southern Chile into national circuits that otherwise would break apart. These routes bring seasonal mobility. Technicians work short contracts in remote zones, medical teams rotate into underserved areas, and tourists arrive in numbers unimaginable during the days when boats were the main option. Yet aviation remains vulnerable, with storms forcing aircraft to circle, volcanoes shutting airports, and unpredictable winds delaying schedules. The sky offers solutions, but never guarantees. Chile's efforts also include massive transport concessions designed specifically to strengthen internal cohesion. Current projects under development, such as the Valparaiso-Santiago Railway concession, new stretches of Route 5, and the Chao Channel Chonchi upgrades in the south, reflect planning aimed directly at overcoming the limits of geography. These projects represent deliberate attempts to stitch together interior and coast, desert and city, with infrastructure that is heavy, permanent, and ideally, more reliable than the improvised connections of the past. Simultaneously, airport expansion projects tendered by agencies like Invest Chile extend capacity to regional centers, further reducing the capital's dominance as the only point of access. The combination of concessions and backbone networks demonstrates that connectivity here is not accidental. It is policy. Each of these projects shares the same condition. Chile does not have the luxury of redundancy. Where a wider nation can reroute through multiple paths, Chile must concentrate its lifelines along tight channels. Roads, rails, cables, and pipelines cling to the spine between mountains and ocean, leaving little room for detours. Engineers and planners have learned to think of the country like a ladder. They must add one rung after another in vertical sequence. Every community that plugs into this chain strengthens the national fabric. Every one left dangling stretches the gaps within it. The paradox, then, is permanent. Chile is globally well connected, with international fiber cables landing on its Pacific coast and companies routing global traffic through its servers. Yet internally, the challenge persists. Residents in Santiago may link instantly to Asia, while only 800 kilometers south families can lose service for hours during storms. At one scale, distance collapses. At another, it remains stubbornly vast. People experience both at once, depending on where they stand. What ties these efforts together is more than the utility of cables, towers, and airports. It is the symbolic act of continuity. When planners speak of the digital backbone, they mean more than bandwidth. The cables are a reaffirmation of Chile as an unbroken line, from desert plateau to freezing fjord. Each kilometer strung with fiber, each highway concession completed, represents the decision to treat the nation not as fragments, but as a single thread. Connectivity here is infrastructure, but it is also identity. And if Chile has learned anything about binding its territory, it is that cohesion must constantly be rebuilt. Technology eases physical distance, but natural forces remain relentless, whether in the deserts, mountains, or southern channels. The durability of connection depends not only on engineering, but on the environment itself. As climate pressures intensify and fragile ecosystems shift across this elongated geography, the test of holding Chile together will no longer be only about people and cables, but about the changing landscapes that both sustain and endanger them. Climate pressure on fragile ecosystems. Chile's geography compresses some of the planet's most fragile ecosystems into a narrow strip, making it unusually vulnerable to climate pressures. Within less than 200 kilometers from coast to mountains, conditions shift from fog deserts to fertile valleys, from alpine snowcaps to southern ice fields. That compressed diversity is striking, but in 2025 it has become a national vulnerability. Each region experiences distinct climate stress, demanding solutions tailored not just for the country as a whole but for each environment it contains. In the far north, the Atacama Desert continues to endure some of the driest conditions on Earth. Rainfall is almost non-existent, and in recent years aquifers have shown signs of severe depletion. Communities that rely on underground reservoirs face growing strain as these sources recharge more slowly than they are being drawn. Higher temperatures only accelerate the problem, and large-scale mining intensifies the competition for water. Many small farmers have been forced to abandon traditional crops. Some maintain production only through costly irrigation drawn from canals fed by desalination plants. What used to be green oases are increasingly faded, testimony to the limits of overstressed aquifers. The central region, historically Chile's agricultural anchor, has not been spared. A Mediterranean climate once made the valleys reliable for orchards, vineyards, and grains. Now, prolonged heat waves and record-low rainfall undermine that stability. Rivers that used to feed farms and hydroelectric plants flow lower each year, with reservoirs unable to balance the difference. Vineyards face irregular ripening seasons, and orchard owners struggle with unpredictable yields. Because around 40% of the population is concentrated near this zone, the effects ripple beyond farming. National food supply, water planning, and energy production all hinge on how these valleys adapt, making the central region's vulnerability a nationwide issue. Farther south, Patagonia underserves a different side of the climate challenge. Its glaciers, long serving as freshwater reserves, are retreating at rates scientists now monitor annually. The consequences are twofold: sudden floods caused by meltwater surges, followed by diminished river flows in later seasons. Communities along these rivers are already adjusting to new cycles that upset generations of knowledge about fishing and irrigation. Wildlife habitats fragment as streams and wetlands change. For many villages, glacial retreat is not an abstract scientific observation, but a shift altering the rhythm of daily life. Across all these regions, the stress points converge. Water is scarcer, agriculture is less predictable, and natural buffers are weakening. Hydroelectric stations produce less energy when reservoirs dip. Farmers plant alternative crops or leave fields fallow. Fishing communities note that species are moving to cooler waters, breaking with long-standing patterns. The result is an uneven but unmistakable picture. Climate disruption is not distant or theoretical here. It is already pulling at the foundational systems Chile depends on. Policy responses have become more formalized in recent years. Chile's Climate Change Framework Law, Law 21.455, enacted in June 2022, made carbon neutrality by 2050 legally binding. The legislation also mandates national adaptation and mitigation plans, requiring ministries and regions to align efforts. At the same time, Chile is expanding renewable energy capacity, with ambitions for renewables to reach roughly 80% of electricity supply by 2030, while phasing down coal use with an eye toward full retirement between 2030 and 2040. These policies ground broad adaptation strategies in legal commitments, signaling that the geographic pressures are also viewed as national security and economic priorities. On the scientific front, Chile has invested in applied climate research. One important institution, the Center for Climate and Resilience Research, CR2, collaborates with universities such as the Pontifical Catholic University of Valparaiso to produce mapping and decision support platforms. These tools give policymakers early warning on drought trends, river flows, and glacier data. By feeding real-time science into planning, Chile not only mitigates risks, but also builds institutional capacity that can be shared with other countries facing similar stresses. Concrete measures are already reshaping responses on the ground. In the north, large desalination plants now line the coast. Once criticized as too expensive, they have become unavoidable. Powered increasingly by solar fields under the Atacama's relentless sun, these facilities pump water inland through long pipelines to sustain both mining operations and towns. Entire communities now depend on desalination for survival, a reminder that technological adaptation has become as important as natural supply. Central Valley communities are also experimenting with diversification. Farmers are trying crop varieties that require less water, while regional governments incentivize reforestation of lands exhausted by overuse. Gradual replacement of non-native pine plantations with mixed-species forests is meant to restore degraded soils and improve local hydrology. These projects involve schools, cooperatives, and landowners, embedding adaptation in community routines. For people living in valley towns, planting native trees is more than ecological. It is seen as an act of protecting their own future. In the south, glacier monitoring has grown into a structured national system. Scientists now rely on ground stations and satellites to track annual mass changes. These measurements, converted into predictive models, inform water allocation for reservoirs and hydropower. Local governments use forecasts to plan for both high-volume floods and future shortages. Early warning systems give residents critical hours to prepare for sudden melt surges, reducing risks to downstream villages. While the glaciers continue to recede, information tools soften the shock and help communities manage the transitions. This mosaic of responses highlights an important evolution in how Chile frames its role. Instead of masking its vulnerability, it often presents itself as a testing ground for adaptation. Desalination under harsh desert conditions becomes a case study for other arid nations. Glacial monitoring provides lessons transferable to Arctic and Himalayan states. Reforestation mixed with rural livelihood strategies informs debates across Latin America. By treating its geography as a laboratory, Chile attracts research collaborations, foreign investment, and a measure of global influence. Yet this positioning remains incomplete and fragile. Farmers in the Central Valleys face continued uncertainty. A single poor harvest can break family businesses. Indigenous communities in the South express concern that cultural ties to sacred glacial landscapes are eroding along with the ice itself. Even desalination, while critical, raises questions about brine disposal and its impact on marine ecosystems. In many instances, the very technologies meant to solve problems also create new environmental and social debates. Progress brings trade-offs, and policy has to adapt continually as new costs emerge. Still, Chile's advantage lies in recognizing these issues openly. By embedding climate targets in law, anchoring adaptation in research institutions, and deploying real infrastructure, the country positions itself not as a finished model but as a work in progress. The political and scientific communities treat geography not as a constraint to hide but as a defining challenge to confront. In that confrontation, they craft strategies that resonate far beyond national borders. But climate adaptation in Chile is never just about ecosystems in isolation. Water, soil, and ice connect directly to its economy and its future place in global trade. And in the country's far north, where the driest desert on Earth conceals one of the world's most critical resources, a new test is emerging. One where climate pressure collides with economic demand in ways that reach far beyond Chile's borders. The lithium dilemma in the north. Why does the driest desert on Earth also carry the weight of powering global industries? The answer lies across the Atacama, where immense salt flats hold some of the world's richest brine lithium deposits. These mineral-rich basins supply a resource that underpins rechargeable batteries used in everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. Without reliable lithium, the global transition away from fossil fuels slows. That is why this desert, once a remote margin of South America, now sits at the center of international industrial and political planning. Chile has been extracting lithium from the Salar Atacama for decades. But by 2025, the scale is unlike anything seen before. Companies spread vast evaporation ponds across the desert floor, pumping brine to the surface to concentrate lithium over months of solar evaporation. Aerial views show kilometers of vivid turquoise squares, but the process carries a hidden cost. Each ton of lithium requires huge volumes of water. Research estimates are on the order of hundreds of cubic meters per ton. In one of the driest places on Earth, where annual rainfall is near zero, such withdrawals are not abstract statistics. They alter aquifer levels, disrupt fragile wetlands, and pressure indigenous communities who depend on limited water for agriculture and daily life. For villages of the Atacama, this trade-off is lived every day. Agriculture that once sustained families, maize, quinoa, and traditional herding, now struggles to survive. Long-used wells sink deeper, and some have gone dry entirely. Residents often receive water delivered by trucks under state programs. This visible dependence under the tension. Global markets benefit from cheaper batteries, while local households confront shrinking livelihoods. Parents speak of children who may inherit neither sustainable land nor viable traditions. Economic benefits are undeniable. Lithium has surged into one of Chile's fastest-growing exports, bringing foreign exchange and attracting multinational firms. Skilled workers find high-paying employment at extraction sites. New infrastructure, airports, processing plants, and energy networks anchors an industrial corridor across the north. In Santiago, officials present lithium as central to branding Chile as a green energy leader. Yet industrial expansion collides with rising protest. Indigenous communities argue the salt flats are not inert mineral fields. They are sacred spaces interwoven with culture and history. To extract without consent, they say, threatens not only ecosystems but identity. By 2025, pressure has risen sharply. Demonstrations across Atacama towns have escalated. Roadblocks, public marches, and petitions in national courts. New hydrological studies show water tables dropping near extraction zones, reinforcing claims that industrial pumping destabilizes fragile aquifers. While scientists debate details of causality, politically the perception is decisive. Communities near San Pedro and Tocaneo link with national organizations, framing their struggle as both an environmental justice and indigenous rights issue. Protests are joined by legal battles, as state bodies intervene directly. In recent years, regulators sanctioned operations for environmental deviations. The Superintendencia del Medio Ambiente, SMA, issued measures against companies like SQM, and Albemarle faced penalties for exceeding operational thresholds. Chile's Council of Defense of the State, CDE, has launched its own litigation against extraction projects, bringing the conflict into the courtroom as well as the desert. Government response has shifted significantly. In April 2023, Chile launched its national lithium strategy, signaling that the resource would no longer be treated purely as a private concession. Central to this change is the arrangement beginning in 2025 between state-owned Codelco and private operator SQM to jointly manage the Salar de Atacama until 2060. Santiago frames this as a model for public-private governance. The state secures royalties and oversight, while companies maintain scale and technical expertise. The plan extends beyond extraction, aiming to distribute benefits more evenly while insisting that operations respect ecological boundaries. The strategy also emphasizes value-adding. Instead of exporting only raw lithium carbonate, policy directs investment toward domestic processing, cathode precursors, battery components, and links to emerging green hydrogen projects. Officials argue that Chile must not remain only a supplier of inputs, but climb the supply chain, capturing manufacturing, research, and long-term industrial clusters. Economic planners describe this as a chance to pivot away from the historic resource trap and build sustained development. Yet the environmental and social debates continue. New desalination projects aim to reduce aquifer withdrawals by providing industrial water from the Pacific. One example is Project Aguas Pacifico, financed partly through institutions like the AIIB, which will pipe desalinated water inland to industries and populations. While promising in principle, desalination carries its own risks. Brine discharge threatens marine ecosystems, energy demand is high, and transporting water through rugged terrain is costly. Inland pilot projects for reusing treated wastewater face similar obstacles of expense and scale. Every proposed solution shifts costs and risks from one system to another, leaving no option uncontested. The global context amplifies urgency. Automakers under pressure to electrify fleets by the 2030s have heightened competition for lithium contracts. Investors push for accelerated output so Chile can consolidate its place as a top supplier before rivals. Argentina, Australia, and soon Bolivia secure larger shares. To restrain extraction risks market share and revenue, but to accelerate risks lasting ecological decline. Neither path is straightforward. Chile portrays its approach as balance. Safeguard aquifers, maintain community participation, fulfill climate commitments, and supply global demand simultaneously. The task is immense, and success uncertain. International observers frame the Atacama as a global test case. If Chile manages sustainable production within one of Earth's harshest environments, it demonstrates that green transitions need not destroy their roots. If it fails, the symbolism is stark. Clean energy built on ecological sacrifice. Policymakers in Europe, Asia, and North America watch Chile's reforms not only for contract opportunities, but for lessons applicable in their own critical mineral regions. For families of the desert, rhetoric translates into daily calculation. Livelihoods depend on juggling small agricultural plots, intermittent wage labor at extraction sites, and state support for water. Children grow up with aquifer levels discussed as often as rainfall. Community assemblies debate whether adaptation is possible or whether long-term survival requires outmigration. Identity remains tightly tied to the landscape. They are proud of contributing to global decarbonization, but wary that sacrifice may outlast compensation. From one angle, the Atacama appears as a strategic hub, measured by production figures and export graphs. From the ground, it is a fragile environment whose people are navigating the contradiction between opportunity and erasure. Negotiating these competing realities is now one of the central responsibilities of the Chilean state. Every policy, new audits, community councils, desalination projects, or co-managed concessions, tries to weave together competing demands that refuse to resolve neatly. Chile's lithium dilemma, then, is broader than technology or markets. It touches directly on questions of sovereignty, cultural recognition, and the extent of state stewardship over land. Those struggles are not confined to the Atacama. Across the country, other indigenous groups voice their own long-standing claims over natural resources and land rights, reminding Chile that the challenge is not only mineral but also historical and social. The Mapuche and indigenous rights today. For generations, one group has remained central to Chile's unfinished story of identity and territory. The Mapuche. They are the largest indigenous nation in the country, and their resistance to outside domination stretches back centuries. Long before the Chilean Republic existed, Mapuche communities controlled wide areas of the southern valleys and forests. Spanish colonizers never fully conquered them, and the Chilean state in the 19th century waged repeated campaigns to annex their lands. That legacy of conflict is not distant memory, but an unresolved present. In 2025, the Mapuche question is still defined by struggles over land, cultural recognition, and political power. These historical conflicts now surface in contemporary disputes. Southern forests, once dominated by native species, were converted into pine and eucalyptus plantations managed by large timber companies. Profits flowed to private firms, while Mapuche communities saw their ancestral territories fenced and titled under laws stemming from colonial allocations. Efforts to reclaim this land today collide head-on with entrenched property law. Where the state frames the issue in terms of security and economic development, Many Mapuche organizations argue that real survival requires land restitution and self-determination. These competing perspectives continue to clash, shaping everyday life in the Araucania and Biobío regions. Chile's constitutional process briefly raised expectations. In the first proposed rewrite, indigenous autonomy and collective rights were placed at the core of the draft text. Debates in neighborhoods and universities gave unprecedented attention to Mapuche voices. But when referendum votes failed to ratify the proposals, the moment left behind an unresolved question: how far should recognition go? By 2025, this remains contested. Supporters argue symbolic gestures are insufficient, while opponents fear that autonomy would weaken central authority. The stalemate reflects not just current politics but centuries of divergent views about land, identity, and the reach of the state. On the ground, these issues translate into episodes of protest and confrontation. In the rural south, groups have occupied lands they identify as ancestral, logging firms have reinforced security, and police operations often escalate tensions. Machinery is set on fire, roads are blocked, and raids disrupt villages. Officials describe their interventions as maintaining order. Critics, however, argue that the reliance on security measures risks criminalizing political protest. States of emergency have been in place for parts of the Araucania since 2021, alongside the application of existing anti-terrorism legislation. Human rights groups warn that such tools, while intended to protect property, blur the line between violent action and legitimate dissent. For residents who live in contested areas, the result is a climate of suspicion, where trust in both companies and state authority is thin. The government has sought a parallel path through institutional reforms. Regional councils now incorporate indigenous participation, introducing elected Mapuche representatives into discussions of education policy, natural resources, and cultural preservation. These bodies reflect an attempt to institutionalize dialogue, providing civic channels instead of confrontation alone. Yet with strictly advisory powers, they are often viewed by communities as limited. Their authority remains narrow, and many activists argue they lack true decision-making capacity. What emerges is a mixed picture. In some areas, officials are cautiously welcomed for consultation. In others, community leaders reject engagement that falls short of full recognition. Land rights remain the most deeply contested front. Legal titles often trace back to 19th century distributions that ignored indigenous boundaries. These documents still carry full authority in court, protecting large estates and company holdings. When Mapuche families attempt reclamation, judges issue rulings based on those historical titles, not ancestral use. A state program to repurchase and return land exists, but its slow pace and limited scope have generated frustration. Every delay or denied claim reinforces the sense that the gap between legal structures and lived identity remains wide. As waiting stretches on, protests intensify and clashes recur. The economic dimension compounds the conflict. Forestry remains one of Chile's major industries, supplying domestic and export markets. Companies argue that land transfers would destabilize long-established production chains. For Mapuche communities, however, pine and eucalyptus monocultures symbolize dispossession. Fast-growing exotic trees deplete water tables, alter soil, and erase the herbal species integral to traditional medicine. Where one side sees contribution to national GDP, the other sees ecological and cultural erasure. It is this difference in perception that keeps standoffs unresolved. Generational changes add new dimensions. Young Mapuche often leave villages to pursue university studies, joining broader urban life. Yet they return through cultural activism, online organizing, and student groups that assert indigenous identity in public debate. Digital platforms circulate messages in Mapudungun and Spanish, amplifying demands around autonomy, environmental justice, and dignity. These networks connect domestic struggles to global indigenous movements, framing Chile's debates within international conversations about rights and recognition. At the political center, governments face opposing pressures. International frameworks, from human rights conventions to environmental standards, encourage advancing indigenous recognition. Domestic constituencies in the South, however, often demand security first. Administrations alternate between dialogue initiatives and robust policing, but neither line offers durable resolution. Some presidents convene commissions and appoint indigenous advisors, while others extend states of emergency and rely on military support. With each electoral cycle, the issue reactivates, underscoring its permanence in Chilean politics. One new development in 2025 has given the debate sharper focus. The Commission for Peace and Understanding, convened to address indigenous state relations, delivered a set of 21 formal recommendations. Among them were the creation of new reparation mechanisms, frameworks for land restitution, and proposals to embed collective indigenous rights within the Constitution. These recommendations stand out for directly confronting territorial claims rather than avoiding them, while also aiming to build state legitimacy through accountability. For many communities, the Commission's proposals were a sign that long-standing grievances are finally being treated with institutional weight. For skeptics, the recommendations reignited fears that autonomy could conflict with national unity. President Gabriel Boric responded to the Commission's report by announcing a new constitutional reform initiative in May 2025, centered on implementing parts of those recommendations. While details remain under debate, the gesture underscored that indigenous recognition is no longer a marginal question but a headline issue in Chile's governance priorities. Observers note that outcomes are far from certain, but the fact that reform itself is back on the agenda signals how the Mapuche conflict has moved from the periphery of policy into the core of national debate. Practical disputes continue alongside these national conversations. In several cases, communities have demanded legally mandated environmental and water studies before new forestry concessions are authorized, citing their right to free, prior, and informed consent. Courts and regulatory bodies now confront test cases in which indigenous rights intersect with large-scale development projects. Chile's own State Defense Council has been involved in litigation around contested lands and environmental impacts, placing the conflict inside the very institutions of the state. Despite new frameworks, lived reality in southern villages mixes continuity and change. Families cultivate small plots, perform ceremonies, and teach language under difficult conditions. Some schools begin to include Mapudungun classes, acknowledging indigenous knowledge within curricula. At the same time, police checkpoints and periodic operations are reminders that negotiations remain incomplete. Communities weigh dialogue against resistance, and mistrust persists. The presence of councils and commissions is welcome to many, but history has left skepticism deep. Chile in 2025 reflects both the advances and limits of this transition. The establishment of the Commission for Peace and Understanding marks the most structured attempt in decades to confront the Mapuche question. Boric's announced constitutional project shows the state recognizes that incremental measures are not enough. Yet daily protests, unresolved land claims, and disputes over forestry demonstrate that reform is an ongoing process. Unlike mineral exports or infrastructure, recognition does not yield quick results. It requires rebuilding trust across generations. The Mapuche question therefore endures as part of a larger challenge: whether Chile can reconcile long histories of exclusion with its current identity as a modern democracy. The answer carries implications beyond the southern forests. It tests the country's ability to project stability and leadership in a region where geography continually places it at the center of strategy and competition. The way Chile handles these internal divides will influence how credibly it can manage challenges abroad, where disputed borders and fragile alliances demand just as much negotiation as those at home. Geopolitical crossroads in the South Cone. Chile's geographic outline draws it repeatedly into regional strategic debates across the southern cone. Its long borders meet the Atacama Desert in the north, where it faces Peru, and Patagonia in the south, where channels brush Argentina. It also fronts more than 4,000 kilometers of Pacific coast and projects directly toward the routes into Antarctica. This positioning does not make Chile the center of every argument in South America, but it does mean many continental questions cannot proceed without its involvement. Trade, maritime rights, Antarctic presence, and critical minerals all place Chile at intersections where regional and global powers inevitably converge. One of the thorniest areas has long been maritime boundaries with Argentina. The two countries have disagreed in the past about where their exclusive zones extend into southern waters. These disputes are not only technical but carry high economic stakes. Fishing grounds, possible hydrocarbon reserves, and strategic shipping lanes. Arbitration processes have prevented open conflict, but pressure remains. In 2025, negotiators revisit corridor definitions south of Cape Horn, reflecting both nations' desire for stable access to Southern Ocean routes. For Chile, these discussions determine whether its position as a major Pacific gatekeeper remains firm or becomes more evenly shared with Argentina. Antarctica widens the point of contention. Both Chile and Argentina maintain research bases there and link their southernmost populations directly to Antarctic claims. Chile, in particular, builds its case by investing in logistics hubs at Punta Arenas and Puerto Williams. Flights and supply ships to Antarctic research stations now depend heavily on these facilities, which Chile presents as proof that it acts as a continental bridge. The symbolism matters in upcoming Antarctic governance debates, where climate change and scientific urgency are expected to trigger new treaty negotiations. By embedding itself in the mechanics of Antarctic science, Chile strengthens the argument that its role must be acknowledged internationally. Regional ties extend northward and eastward as well. Brazil, Argentina, and Peru all seek transport corridors that connect their resources and markets to the Pacific. Chile's ports at Valparaiso and San Antonio offer faster access to Asia than routes through other countries, but reliance on them means entrusting Chile with part of each neighbor's economic flow. In response, Chile has invested in infrastructure not only to handle its own exports, but also to position itself as a platform for continental trade. For example, the Ruta 68P3 concession awarded in 2025 is upgrading a key highway between Santiago and Valparaiso, a move framed as national infrastructure, but also as a boost to Brazil and Argentina-linked cargo. Port modernization programs underway along the Central Coast reinforce this approach, tying Chile's internal projects directly to its regional leverage. That infrastructure diplomacy connects immediately to energy debates. Hydrogen projects planned for Patagonia's wind corridors make little sense without cross-border distribution. Running pipelines or electric transmission lines into Argentina or Brazil requires cooperation at technical and political levels. These projects are not yet complete, but by 2025 negotiations over shared grids are active. Chilean diplomats often present them as opportunities for collective gain rather than concessions. Hydrogen, they argue, is too large for one country's market. Opening routes benefits the entire region. It is there, in technical integration, that Chile casts itself as a mediator rather than a rival, giving partners reasons to cooperate even when tensions persist elsewhere. This cooperative angle extends to Antarctic science as well. Maintaining stations there is expensive, and Chile has courted partnerships by offering its southern ports as staging areas. Argentina and Brazil use these hubs for their own expeditions, reinforcing Chile's status by default. Hosting joint expenses gives Chile diplomatic credit while embedding neighbors into its supply chain. The approach transforms costly geography into reinforcing influence. Every time partners rely on Chilean logistics, they indirectly accept its claim to being central in southern polar operations. Still, unresolved flashpoints simmer. In Patagonia, disputes from 19th century treaties still appear in political rhetoric and cultural memory. Although conflict is unlikely, nationalist rhetoric occasionally revives claims or grievances, complicating efforts at a united stance. Fishing rights flare near Cape Horn, where fleets test ambiguous boundaries. Chile's tactic is to convert these disputes into negotiation platforms. Joint surveys or shared regulatory discussions allow it to channel conflict into cooperation, giving each disagreement a dual function as both risk and leverage. Global actors complicate this picture further. In 2025, controversy rose in northern Chile over a proposed Chinese-funded astronomical observatory, with local and foreign critics questioning whether the installation blurred lines between scientific cooperation and strategic presence. The debate highlighted how outside powers exploit Chile's geography for interests that go beyond the region. The issue was not whether China was hostile, but how projects tied into wider patterns of influence, especially when combined with investments in energy and minerals. Lithium sharpens these dynamics. Chinese companies are already present in Chile's lithium sector, pursuing joint ventures or bidding for contracts. When Chile announced its national lithium strategy in 2023 and confirmed co-management structures beginning in 2025, foreign investors followed closely to assess what the rules meant for market access. Domestically, debates center on how much of the lithium supply chain should remain in private hands versus state control. Internationally, the concern is whether rules will allow or restrict Chinese involvement. The uncertainty injects a diplomatic edge into what might otherwise appear a purely commercial debate. Washington, Brussels, and Beijing alike monitor developments, reading Chile's lithium policy as a signal of its broader alignment in global energy transitions. These global tensions reinforce Chile's paradoxical influence. Its outline on the map looks fragile, but thinness anchors choke points that others cannot avoid. Argentina may complain about maritime lines, but shared fisheries require joint regulation. Brazil may worry about dependency, but access to the Pacific makes Chile essential for exporting commodities eastward. Peru remains an economic competitor in the north, yet both countries work within intertwined mining export systems. The necessity of cooperation places Chile in a constant position of negotiation, where its weaknesses become partial strengths. Diplomacy thus pivots on selective engagement. Chile emphasizes environmental monitoring, maritime safety, and renewable energy development as areas where it can host multilateral cooperation without generating nationalist backlash. When neighbors' energy grids link into Chilean corridors, or when joint Antarctic missions launch from Chilean ports, institutional ties deepen in ways that are difficult to undo. This embeddedness is the quieter advantage of Chile's geography. It creates indispensability without requiring dominance. By 2025, Chile continues to tread carefully. Its leaders cannot afford to alienate neighbors because so much of its trade relies on shared corridors. At the same time, conceding too much authority would dilute the very advantages its geography provides. Each decision over roads, lithium contracts, port concessions, or polar research is weighed against that tension. Short-term concessions often secure immediate stability, but long-term positioning determines whether Chile maintains leverage in a shifting global order. Taken together, these dynamics reveal why Chile functions as a geopolitical crossroads in the southern cone. Geography forces it into disputes, but policy choices determine whether those disputes drain influence or reinforce it. The country's success lies in framing vulnerabilities as platforms for negotiation. Every maritime disagreement transformed into cooperative regulation, every Antarctic investment presented as shared science, every lithium debate elevated into strategic planning. This pattern may not eliminate friction, but it ensures Chile remains a constant reference point whenever continental or global strategies intersect in South America. The key test is whether these same patterns sustain Chile's broader economic role. Infrastructure diplomacy, lithium governance, and Antarctic projection all matter, but their ultimate weight derives from what they mean for trade. The long Pacific frontage that seems geographically awkward in the interior becomes critical internationally. Understanding how Chile turns its thin coastline into leverage requires shifting from diplomacy inland to the reality of ports and global supply chains. And it is along that 4,000-kilometer margin where Chile's next challenge unfolds. Trade superhighway of the Pacific. Chile's Pacific frontage has become one of the busiest entry points on the continent, shaping how goods, resources, and markets connect in 2025. More than 4,000 kilometers of uninterrupted coastline position the country directly along shipping lanes that move between Asia and South America. Container vessels stream past the central coast every day, carrying electronics, machinery, foodstuffs, and in the opposite direction, the copper and lithium that dominate Chile's export profile. Mining accounts for a significant share of the nation's economy, over 18% of GDP and more than half of export earnings. So the link between resource corridors inland and maritime gateways on the coast defines much of the country's global role. To handle this traffic, Chile has sharpened its port efficiency. Valparaiso and San Antonio, the two main terminals closest to the capital, are undergoing automation upgrades. Cranes guided by digital systems, scanners that speed customs procedures, and tracking software that coordinates containers across ships, yards, and trucks. The reforms aim to reduce congestion, prepare for very large vessels, and guarantee quick turnarounds for exporters tied into strict delivery schedules. Port authorities present these investments not only as national improvements, but as essential pieces of the Asia-Pacific logistics chain. The challenge is that these high-performing ports sit far from where much of the export wealth is produced. Copper and lithium come out of mines in the far north, around Antofagasta and the Atacama Basin, often more than 1,000 kilometers away from Valparaiso's docks. Moving heavy or unprocessed minerals south requires fleets of trucks grinding along highways for days, raising costs and creating bottlenecks. Even when ports are ready to load, the internal journey slows the system. This separation of extraction zones from export hubs adds expense and complexity, rather than undermining competitiveness outright. But it highlights how geography forces Chile to manage an imbalance between global access and internal distance. To bridge that gap, new infrastructure projects are underway. Railway modernization is at the center of strategy, with concessions designed to reconnect northern mining zones to maritime gateways more efficiently than trucks alone can provide. The Valparaiso-Santiago rail concession, advanced through Invest Chile in 2025, is one example, meant to accelerate cargo out of the capital region toward the coast. Likewise, the Ruta 68 P3 highway upgrade, awarded to SASA, is modernizing the busy corridor between Santiago and Valparaiso, cutting transfer times and easing truck congestion. These projects are framed as reinforcements of national competitiveness, each improving the tight chain that stretches from desert operations to central ports. Northern ports are also gaining attention. Expanded facilities near Antofagasta and other coastal towns reduce the distance minerals must travel, allowing some shipments to move directly from mine regions onto global routes. Though smaller than Valparaiso or San Antonio, these terminals widen the export network, ensuring one strike, earthquake, or bottleneck near Santiago does not paralyze the entire trade system. By dispersing logistical hubs up and down the length of the coast, Chile creates resilience that mirrors its elongated map. Eastward connections add yet another layer. New tunnels, highways, and customs agreements across the Andes are designed to link Chilean ports with Atlantic markets. For Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, the Pacific often provides faster access to Asian consumers than shipping via the Atlantic and through longer global routes. Improved trans-Andean corridors could funnel soy, beef, and manufactured goods westward, making Chile not just an exporter of its own resources, but a broader transit bridge for its neighbors. In this scenario, Chilean ports become continental infrastructure rather than national bottlenecks. Trade with Asia anchors all these strategies. China remains Chile's top buyer, taking in immense quantities of copper, lithium, and agricultural exports, alongside strong demand from Japan, South Korea, and emerging Southeast Asian markets. When shipping alliances schedule stops at Valparaiso or San Antonio before rerouting north or south, Chile integrates into global delivery calendars in ways smaller competitors struggle to match. For officials, each container crane or digital scanner becomes more than machinery. It is a point of alignment between distant supply chains and local capacity. Logistical fragility persists. Highway networks south from the desert mines funnel traffic into narrow valleys where strikes, accidents, or floods can halt transit for days. Each addition to port efficiency loses impact if minerals remain stuck inland. Every kilometer of trucking requires contracts for fuel, fleets, and drivers, adding costs that ripple outward into the final price of exports. In practice, global buyers see delays not in ships, but in journeys toward the ships, underscoring the point that Chile's export strength depends as much on interior corridors as on coastline upgrades. This explains why government planning emphasizes integration rather than isolated projects. Modern ports, improved highways, and expanded rails are knit into comprehensive logistics policies. Invest Chile coordinates foreign participation in concessions to ensure international standards in design and speed. New air cargo arrangements supplement maritime flow for goods where time outweighs bulk. Together, these efforts are intended to reinforce Chile's reputation as a reliable point of transfer in a global market that prizes predictability. Chile's narrowness, once viewed as weakness, shapes this advantage. Crossing the Andes to the Pacific is shortest here, meaning transport from Brazil or Argentina can often reach Asia faster through Chilean ports than through wider detours farther north. This geographical constraint simplifies choices. Fewer corridors, fewer alternate routes, but faster ones. Concentration becomes coherence. Where other countries scatter infrastructure, Chile's long, narrow form strings it along a single corridor. Efficiency arises because geography leaves little room for distraction. By 2025, the model is recognizable. Modern ports aligned with Asia, upgraded corridors binding deserts to coasts, and continental partnerships that expand Chile's reach beyond its borders. Challenges remain in cost, distance, and fragility, but the structure is coherent. Chile has become both gateway and bridge, a country that leverages its awkward outline by making it simple for others to rely on. This trade architecture, however, is only one dimension of geography's influence. The same thin shape that makes ports and corridors decisive also defines how resources like sun, wind, and rivers line up across the land. Those patterns are beginning to set Chile's course in another arena, where the fight for competitiveness is linked not to ports but to power. And it is in that arena where Chile's geography again turns constraint into possibility. The new energy corridor. Energy strategy in Chile today rests on geography as much as on policy. The country's long, narrow outline lines up solar deserts, fast-flowing rivers, and windy plains in a sequence that forms the basis of what officials describe as a national energy corridor. In 2025, that idea is more than just a metaphor. It underpins Chile's drive to become a leader in renewable power, linking resources spread over thousands of kilometers into one system. The Atacama Desert remains the foundation of this plan. With its extraordinarily clear skies and long hours of direct sunlight, it is among the most powerful solar regions in the world. Solar farms already stretch across vast areas, feeding the grid, supporting lithium processing, and powering desalination plants that keep nearby communities viable. According to the Climate Action Tracker, Chile has already multiplied its output from non-conventional renewable energy more than fivefold between 2014 and 2020, and growth continues. What once seemed an inhospitable expanse now functions as the engine room of Chile's solar future. At the far other end of the national map, Patagonia provides the second pillar of the system. Its geography funnels strong winds through open plains and narrow channels with remarkable consistency. Turbines now occupy strategic sites, delivering steady flows of electricity far beyond the demand of the sparsely populated south. The surplus energy highlights Chile's dilemma. It can be produced with ease but must travel vast distances to reach mines, factories, and cities in the north and center. The mismatch between where energy is created and where it is used defines much of Chile's current infrastructure planning. Hydropower sits between these extremes, both geographically and strategically. The Central Valleys and the Andes have supplied dams for decades, covering a large share of the national grid. But changing rainfall patterns have weakened the reliability of hydroelectricity. Long droughts in the central region expose dependence on rivers as a vulnerability, reminding Chileans that hydropower alone cannot guarantee stability. This is where solar and wind step in, not as marginal supplements, but as essential balance against climate volatility. The backbone of the entire system is transmission. Carrying energy from one end of a 300-kilometer country to the other requires more than conventional grids. That is why Chile has committed to expanding high-voltage direct current lines, capable of moving power with far fewer losses. One prominent project, the Low Aguirre Entre Rios line, has been publicly discussed as a key step, but its schedule remains uncertain due to permitting and environmental reviews. Officials nevertheless frame these long-distance lines as essential to making the energy corridor viable. Only with such connectors can power flow efficiently from the desert to the valleys, and from Patagonia to the industrial heartland. Policy makes these ambitions more than aspirational. Chile's climate change framework law set carbon neutrality by 2050 as a legal requirement. The government has also endorsed coal phase-out timelines, targeting full retirement between 2030 and 2040, while setting an official goal of reaching 80% renewable generation by 2030. These targets ground the language of the energy corridor in binding commitments. National planning documents frame renewable deployment not as optional, but as essential if Chile is to meet climate obligations while expanding its energy capacity. One new element in this shift is green hydrogen. Electrolysis plants in the Atacama and Patagonia now use surplus renewable power to split water and store energy as hydrogen. The government calls this a strategic bet and has promoted international partnerships with Germany, Japan, and the European Union. Green hydrogen represents a way to export renewable power rather than just consume it domestically. Chile is actively pursuing this strategy alongside efforts to electrify its mining sector, gradually replacing diesel-powered operations with renewable power inputs. The goal is to align clean energy not only with households, but with the industries that form much of the country's economic base. These ideas already reshape local life. In the Atacama, solar developments have cushioned town economies that previously depended on volatile mining cycles. In Patagonia, turbines rise across the horizon of fishing towns, a reminder that energy projects are now reconfiguring landscapes that once felt isolated from global trends. Jobs, subsidies, and controversies all follow. Residents ask who gains from new infrastructure, what happens to local ecosystems, and whether the benefits will remain in the community. These debates ensure that renewables are not just technical ventures, but social and political ones. Challenges persist regardless of optimism. Drought continues to undermine hydropower. Dust accumulation reduces efficiency for solar farms. Wind turbines attract criticism for noise, impact on birds, and changes to visual landscapes. Hydrogen projects cost billions and remain in development phases, with significant uncertainty about scaling exports. Transmission corridors cut through delicate terrain, triggering disputes over land rights and environmental impact assessments. Each problem underscores that building the corridor involves layers of negotiation between technology, governance, and ecology. Even so, Chile's integration of diverse systems shows meaningful progress. Engineers are advancing methods to balance solar surpluses with wind strength and hydro reserves, smoothing volatility in the grid. Expansion of storage projects and smart distribution networks aims to match demand with available supply. The country's investment boards present renewable integration as not just feasible but already underway. Production from solar and wind has exceeded past projections, supporting claims that Chile now runs largely on non-fossil generation during daytime hours. International response reflects this trajectory. Foreign governments and investors treat Chile as a laboratory for large-scale renewable development. Reports from Climate Action Tracker and other organizations identify Chile as aligned with pathways consistent with a 1.5 degrees Celsius global target if ambitions hold. That credibility shapes trade agreements, financing, and partnerships. Chile's energy reputation becomes a bargaining asset as much as its copper or lithium reserves. The notion of a new energy corridor crystallizes all these developments into one framework. Rather than fragmented regional projects, the concept emphasizes continuity. Solar energy surges from the north, hydro stabilizes the center, and wind powers from the south, all channeled by long-distance lines and emerging hydrogen plants into a single national system. It does not erase distance or fragility, but it offers a pathway to coherence. In that sense, energy has become another form of connectedness, Chile binding itself across its stretched outline not just with roads or cables, but with responses to environmental and economic imperatives. By 2025, this framing has caught on both domestically and abroad. Chile is no longer discussed merely as a consumer of global energy, but as a contributor to global change. If its coal exit proceeds, its renewable deployments increase, and its hydrogen exports materialize, Chile could shift from being a vulnerable corridor nation to a net exporter of stability and clean energy. Much remains to be proven, but geography, policy, and technology together make the ambition credible. The spatial logic of this corridor also alters how Chile conceives of its ends. It is not only about connecting deserts to valleys or valleys to fjords. The energy system now stretches to channels at the very bottom of the continent, where natural forces are even more extreme. At that southern tip, Chile faces not just the challenge of internal integration, but a frontier that reaches beyond national territory altogether. Gateway to the ends of the earth. At Chile's southernmost edge, the land breaks into narrow channels and scattered islands before giving way to Antarctica. This corner of the map has always looked remote, but by 2025 it has become central to Chile's influence. The southern tip now functions as a bridgehead into Antarctic affairs, not through declarations of control, but by positioning itself as a logistical hub. The question Chile faces is how to translate its geography into lasting influence in a region where science, cooperation, and long-term planning shape outcomes. Two towns make this role tangible: Punta Arenas and Puerto Williams. Punta Arenas, located along the Strait of Magellan, is no longer just a regional capital. Its docks, warehouses, and specialized shipping companies now handle the bulk of supplies bound for Antarctic missions. Its airport, with upgraded cargo capacity, has become one of the few continental entry points capable of supporting flights across the Drake Passage. Puerto Williams, further south on Navarino Island, has shifted from a small naval outpost into a recognized Antarctic staging center. Both towns host research support, tourism services, and naval infrastructure, placing them at the heart of Chile's claim to act as a gateway to the southern frontier. Competition adds dimension to this role. Argentina promotes Ushuaia, across the Beagle Channel, as its Antarctic hub. It shares almost the same distance advantage as Punta Arenas, and both countries now regularly present facilities, ports, and science investments to strengthen their position. The rivalry reflects competitive cooperation rather than confrontation. Both nations recognize Antarctic governance is bound by treaties that require collaboration. Diplomatic channels manage disputes, while each side invests in local infrastructure to project its relevance when Antarctic frameworks are eventually reviewed. Distance itself is an advantage. From Chile's southern coast, ships reach the Antarctic Peninsula in roughly 1,000 kilometers, one of the shortest routes in the world. This proximity reduces time, fuel, and costs compared to farther gateways like Christchurch in New Zealand or Hobart in Australia. For researchers setting up seasonal bases, or for vessels delivering scientific cargo, the savings are substantial. Argentina enjoys a similar benefit from Ushuaia, but Chile emphasizes its chain of supporting assets: naval ships, weather monitoring, and data links connecting directly to universities and research centers further north. Influence is signaled less by holding territory and more by sustaining the infrastructure that makes Antarctic access possible. Climate change heightens these stakes. As Antarctic ice sheets retreat and ecosystems shift, data collection becomes urgent. For Chile, being able to host teams in Punta Arenas and Puerto Williams and fly them quickly to Antarctic stations ensures a steady flow of research activity. Scientific outputs from these hubs feed into global climate models and policy debates. Maps compiled in Punta Arenas often inform discussions in Geneva and New York, giving Chile weight in forums where climate strategy is negotiated. By anchoring scientists at its southern towns, the country projects influence well beyond its borders. Chile frames its southern posture in contrast to its northern frontier. In the Atacama, desert skies support world-class observatories that monitor space. In the south, naval bases and research institutes furnish insight into frozen seas and ice. The juxtaposition works in Chile's favor, a single country offering capacity both for astronomy and for polar science. Officials make the case that Chile provides global platforms for exploration in two opposite directions, uniting extremes of geography into a coherent identity. Investments back these claims. Agreements in 2025 expand research facilities at Puerto Williams, equipping laboratories for glaciology, marine biology, and atmospheric science. Supplies flow through Punta Arenas, reinforced by expanded warehouses and new fiber optic links feeding data directly north. Chilean universities sign protocols with foreign institutions, providing access to polar environments in exchange for collaborative funding and expertise. These partnerships convert Chile's logistical advantage into long-term academic credibility. Access, more than declarations, becomes the currency of influence. Yet Argentina remains Chile's closest competitor. Its government promotes Ushuaia relentlessly, highlighting naval bases and tourist services as proof of its Antarctic positioning. Political leaders from both countries stage high-level visits to their southern cities, turning facilities into symbols as much as infrastructure. In practice, both know that Antarctic negotiations remain governed by the Antarctic Treaty System. Neither country can extend sovereignty outright. Instead, each projects presence with the hope of shaping future governance, accumulating evidence of commitment through science, logistics, and regular use. Beyond South America, Chile competes with distant but well-funded Antarctic gateways. New Zealand, through Christchurch, hosts heavy international science collaboration, while Australia invests heavily via Hobart. Chile recognizes it cannot match resource depth, but it highlights its location: closer ports, shorter voyages, and efficient costs. The pitch is straightforward. International teams save time and money staging from Punta Arenas rather than flying across oceans. Marketing this efficiency becomes part of Chile's diplomacy, making the case that it holds not ownership but practical indispensability. Tourism adds another dimension. Visits to Antarctica have surged, with most cruises departing from South American ports. Punta Arenas and Puerto Williams increasingly act as departure points for ships carrying thousands of visitors each summer season. Hotels, tourist docks, and service companies now line their waterfronts. For local economies, the growth is visible through jobs and revenue. For policymakers, it is a reason to keep investing in southern capacity. Research stations might bring prestige, but tourism brings sustained economic integration. Together, they lock the region's identity into being an Antarctic gateway. Naval deployments reinforce this message. Chilean vessels patrol southern channels, escorting research ships, training crews, and maintaining visibility in contested waters. These are not aggressive actions. They are acts of presence, daily reminders that Chile takes its southern responsibilities seriously. Argentina does much the same, emphasizing that both nations see Antarctic logistics as not only economic and scientific, but part of broader national strategy. Their parallel deployments understand that influence here is measured less by confrontation, more by persistence. Maintaining connection with the far south is costly, but geography demands it. Flights from Santiago link daily to Punta Arenas, ferries cross to Puerto Williams, and state funds ensure subsidies keep services running. Every connection ensures these towns remain integrated into national systems rather than treated as isolated outposts. What might otherwise seem a frontier becomes a platform for Chile's claim to Antarctic relevance. Fragile terrain becomes strength when tied firmly into the national spine. This alignment of northern observatories with southern polar gateways illustrates a broader pattern. Chile leverages its extremes to insert itself into global conversations. One end of the country produces data for astronomy. The other produces data for climate science. This dual role positions Chile as both outward-looking and Earth-focused, claiming partnership in fields that define humanity's future. The tension between fragility and advantage lies at the center of its national identity. In 2025, Chile's approach is measured. Antarctic governance still runs through cooperation, not unilateral action. Scientific collaboration remains the main currency, and disasters or disruptions require coordinated response. Chile's strategy is to make itself indispensable to partners. By investing in ports, airports, and research facilities in its south, it ensures Antarctic routes and science projects cannot easily exclude it. Rather than declaring control, it projects relevance, building credibility with each expedition, voyage, and agreement. For local residents, the transformation is practical as well as symbolic. Jobs arise in universities, hospitality, cargo, and tourist services. Ports handle more traffic. Airports expand runways. Labs recruit students from northern cities. Communities once defined by remoteness now identify as gateways, tied directly into international missions. The benefits feel uneven at times, and debates over environmental impact continue, but the momentum is unmistakable. Geography now connects them to global systems. What emerges is continuity with Chile's broader story. The country takes difficult terrain and reframes it as leverage. From the Pacific coastline to the Atacama deserts, and across to the far south, Chile's outline repeatedly forces adaptation. By investing, connecting, and projecting presence, it turns apparent limits into anchors of influence. The southern gateway to Antarctica exemplifies this pattern. Distant, costly, and fragile, yet increasingly decisive in how Chile shapes its identity on the world stage. In the end, the view from Punta Arenas and Puerto Williams is more than a local story. It captures how Chile uses its shape, thin, stretched, and extreme, to find advantage where others might see weakness. That same logic applies across the nation, forming a consistent thread that explains how limitations can become tools. Understanding that thread is key to grasping how Chile now defines itself and how it prepares for what comes next. Chile's unusual geography once looked like a permanent liability. A strip so narrow and elongated seemed destined for disconnection and fragility. Yet by 2025, The same outline aligns with clear advantages: Pacific-facing ports that anchor trade, renewable energy zones stretching north to south, and southern gateways that connect directly to Antarctica. Geography now offers Chile distinct opportunities, provided they are managed wisely. What really matters is governance. Success depends on equitable water policy in the lithium-rich north, climate adaptation backed by the 2022 Climate Change Framework Law, and Indigenous dialogue shaped by the Mapuche Commission's 21 recommendations. Chile's thinness has turned constraint into concentrated potential. Its future rests on how effectively it balances those pressures. If you'd like a focused follow-up on lithium policy or Antarctica's logistics hubs, let us know in the comments.